Today we're going to be looking at the Great Fourth Century. This was one of the most incredible centuries in world history. It was quite an amazing thing that happened during this century. So it started off with the Diocletian persecution in 303 AD, which was the worst persecution that the church had ever had. And it lasted empire-wide until 313 with the Edict of Milan. It was begun by the Emperor Diocletian, and for 10 years the church went through terrible times, and many people, especially pastors and bishops, suffered through that whole time. That's how the century started off. The century ended with the emperors at least claiming to be Christian, and Christianity being the official religion of the Roman Empire, all in 100 years. This is amazing. You see, for almost 1,000 years, this area had been steeped in paganism and pagan idolatry of the Roman world, the Roman and Greek world. The interesting thing is that even before the Romans and the Greeks began to rise in that area, there was still idolatry going on before that. So over 1,000 years, pagan idolatry reigned. Gods and goddesses developing pagan temples for worship and all of those things. And it was all gone within 100 years. Temples were torn down within 100 years or turned into churches. Churches were built, and this is the great building plan of the emperor Constantine, is to build churches and to house the influx of converted people that were coming out of the pagan world. And of course, attending that great influx of people into the churches, many false conversions, and people just coming in because of political expediency, because it was seen as being better to be a Christian now. And so preaching had to change a lot in some ways in order to be more evangelistic and to call the pagans even in their midst to repentance and faith. Now, as we go in and through this time, I want you to know that there were 5 things kind of going on. It was a century of theological development. It was a century of creeds and the development of creeds, I believe statements, right? It was a century of the first 2 great ecumenical councils, 2 of the 4 of the great ecumenical councils, and the first 2 were in this century. And then it was a century of building of church wealth, because now all of a sudden Christians are in Christianity is the favored religion, and so it is a building of church wealth, and a century, lastly, fifthly, a century of great men. So this was a century that had tremendous theological change and development. With the church no longer just in survival mode under persecution, they began to teach and explore how to understand who Christ was. So with the end of persecution, now they can begin to develop and understand better and better and more who Christ was and what his relationship was to the Father. And with that also came some heresies, because heresies are people trying to understand how these things work as well. And so as they began to look at the scriptures and to apply the scriptures, they also developed false ideas, and so those needed to be dealt with. And it started off really first with the leader of the early heresy of this century, Arius. But that would be followed by some other Christological heresies as well, like Apollinarianism and Monophysitism and Monothelitism. And so those are heresies that we'll be taking a look at over the next couple weeks as well. So with these heresies, it called for an orthodox response. And so when you have Arius rising up and saying things like Jesus is the firstborn of creation, that he was created first over all things and then he created, now we have a problem, because Jesus is not God. He's God-like, but not fully God. And so this calls for an orthodox response. And that orthodox response against Arius came from Alexander of Alexandria. And Arius was from Libya, and he was teaching in Alexandria. He was one of the presbyters in Alexandria, but his bishop over the city, Alexander, recognized that there was some false teaching going on here, because we worship Jesus as God. And if we're worshiping Jesus as God and he's not, then we are engaged in idolatry. But if Jesus is God, then we do need to be worshiping him. And so there was this conflict between Alexander and Arius, and then Alexander's assistant, the young Athanasius. So the conflict eventually led to the first of the great ecumenical councils. Now, again, ecumenical, what does that mean? That means worldwide, or across the entire empire, empire-wide. And I would say worldwide is a better rendering of that, or a better definition of that. And so this led to the first great ecumenical council at Nicaea. And it was over this conflict between Alexander and Arius, and there were two sides in the empire, especially in the eastern part of the empire, vying for which side was right. And so the emperor, seeing these things, and himself having claimed to be now a Christian, the emperor Constantine called together over 300 bishops from across the empire to meet at Nicaea. And so they all gathered together at Nicaea, and he called them together to unite the church into one proper, right, and true teaching. And that's his goal, was to bring that about. And so what they did over the course of time was they put together an early version of the Nicene Creed. And they used words in the midst of trying to decide all of these things, in the midst of wrestling through these things. They used words like homoousios and homoiousios and heterousios and homoios and anoimoios to explain the relationship between Jesus and the Father, and who Jesus was, and is he God or is he not? And so all of these words became very important in the debate. It seemed at 325 that the Orthodox party had won. And so when they left Nicaea, it seemed as though the Orthodox came out on top. But over the next couple years, the Arians persuaded the emperor to their side. And so he flip-flopped. He went from Orthodox to Arian, and back and forth. Athanasius spent the rest of his life. Alexander died 3 years after Nicaea began, and Athanasius then took up the mantle, and Athanasius spent the rest of his life embroiled in the battle to defend the Orthodox doctrine of homoousios, what we have there in the Nicene Creed, that Jesus is of the same substance as the Father. And he and those who followed him, the Cappadocians and Hilary from what is now France, or Gaul then, and John Chrysostom, they worked to understand Jesus as God and also how to understand the Trinity, and they taught that and brought those things in their writings to the forefront in Christian theology. Now, as I said, the second thing was, it was the century of creedal development. The first great one, the first great creed, was developed at Nicaea in 325, and there were some things that needed to be worked through, and it wasn't quite complete, but it served its purpose for several decades. But by the 380s, it was seen as needing some further development. And so we had the second ecumenical council at Constantinople in 381, where they produced the final version of what we know as the Nicene Creed. Technically, it should be called the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, and so it was completed in 381. Now, sandwiched between these two great ecumenical councils, Nicaea and Constantinople, there were tremendous changes in the empire and great controversy in the church. So let's talk a little bit about the great changes in the empire. Imagine, and I'm going to use an illustration that I think might hit home with you all. So imagine India. You are in the context of India. Imagine India that has been steeped in Hinduism and Hindu idolatry for thousands of years. Imagine India having a council in 2025, just 4 years from now. Having a council in 2025 where your president of India called all the pastors who could come to Delhi for a great council. And at that council, they were given the task to come up with a standard declaration for unity in the Indian church. And Christianity was no longer to be a persecuted faith in India, but was suddenly the favored religion of India. Suddenly, as all of that happened, immediately many of the moderate Hindus, who were in name only Hindus, really doing those things out of expediency, suddenly they all began seeking the favor of the leaders of the empire, or the leaders of India, including the president, and they came flocking into your churches where you are serving. The president begins to give money to the churches as well to build new buildings and to develop their churches, to pay pastors, and Hindu temples begin to fall into disuse, or they get revitalized and be adapted into church buildings. And many of the idols were taken out and smashed, and temples were turned into these Christian churches. All by declaration from your president. But during the course of all of this, there developed 2 or 3 versions of Christianity. There were the oneness Pentecostals, let's say, who didn't believe in the Trinity, and there were the Reformed Presbyterians and Baptists, and then there developed a middle way. There developed a middle way between these two groups called the Methodists, and each group vied for their own group to be the dominant one. But the Reformed Presbyterians and the Baptists, even though they at times over the course of years were the smallest group, they had some great teachers who were able to really continue speaking the truth and holding steadfast to the truth of God's word and showing the error of the other 2 groups. And they used the Bible to do that. The problem is that the Indian president, while starting out Reformed and as let's say a Reformed Presbyterian, began to be persuaded to Pentecostalism by their arguments. And he went back and forth between the two, as did the presidents who followed him. But for 60 years, there was fighting back and forth between these 2 or 3 versions of Christianity, again, each trying to show the truth of their position. And then, all of a sudden, in the middle of the century, a Hindu president came to power. And he wanted to revert back to all the Hindu ways. He wanted to bring back the glory of ancient Hinduism, and he began to favor Hinduism and build back the Hindu temples. And the churches had to deal with that now. But he only had 1 term, and then another Christian president was elected. But thanks to the efforts of half a dozen men in India through that century, Reformed Christianity began to prevail. And in 2081, another council finalized the original standard declaration of what true Indian Christianity was to confess. And from that point on, Hinduism was no longer even a viable religion in India. It was, for the most part, gone. Can you imagine that? I mean, can you really imagine something like that taking place? Well, that is basically exactly what happened in the Roman Empire in the 4th century. It went from a pagan empire where you had temples and gods and goddesses everywhere. Just look at Acts 17 and you get a feel for what that looked like in the 1st century Roman Empire. Very similar, I think, to what you see in India with Hinduism. And so it went from that from a pagan empire like that to Christianity being a legal religion, to within 2 generations, the official religion of the empire, and Hinduism virtually gone. Paganism virtually gone. Can you imagine that? Just think about that happening. That's how quickly things can change when God sets to change things. And he could do that there in India. Christianity became a legal religion in 325, to by 381 the official religion of the empire under Emperor Theodosius, influenced in great measure by the great church father Ambrose. But what form of Christianity? That's the question. What form of Christianity was going to prevail in the empire? That was what was being questioned. Sometimes it looked as though Orthodoxy would win the day, like in 325 after the Nicene Creed, and at other times Arian Christianity seemed to be winning. But God, in his providence, worked the prevailing power of the Orthodox Christian faith to eventually win out and to be the dominant. And when I say Orthodox Christian faith, I don't mean Eastern Orthodoxy. I'm talking about right-thinking Christianity, biblical, faithful Christianity. That's what I mean by Orthodox. It is the right doctrine, the right praise. And that is what is being meant. That's what I'm meaning by when I say, in this context, Orthodox Christian faith. And so that is what happened. Finally, at the Second Ecumenical Council of Constantinople in 381, Orthodox Christianity ultimately came out on top thanks to the efforts of some really important church fathers and the persevering providence of God. Now, what about these important church fathers? Who were these men? Who were these men? The first two you'll hear about this week is Alexander of Alexandria and Athanasius. And these two men were the defenders of the true faith at Nicaea. And so they were about the task of teaching and encouraging the faith of the Orthodox in the Roman Empire. Now, Bishop Alexander died 3 years after Nicaea, and his assistant Athanasius became Bishop of Alexandria and took his place and would defend orthodoxy until his death in the 370s. Because of his foundational work that especially Athanasius did, he laid the groundwork, he laid the foundation for others to build upon, men like the 3 Cappadocians. Now, Cappadocia is a region in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. And these 3 Cappadocians were Basil the Great, or Basil the Great, his brother Gregory of Nyssa, and their friend Gregory of Nazianzus. These men really theologically advanced the understanding of the Trinity and of Jesus being fully God and fully man. And so you will read some of their writings this week as well as you think through what this century was like. And you'll read those writings, and as you're reading those, think about how indebted we are to their writings and how indebted we are to their faithfulness, and in really digging into the scriptures and understanding the scriptures and thinking through these theological concepts that are very important and that are very important for our faith and who we are as people. You'll also briefly encounter a man by the name of Hilary of Poitiers. And Hilary was another Western sort of Athanasius, an important defender of Orthodox faith in the West. And he also was writing and in contact with the Eastern Fathers. The Cappadocians also had a younger friend, and his name was John Chrysostom, who was a tremendous preacher. In fact, his name, Chrysostom, means golden mouth. That's how beautiful his words were. And so he was a tremendous preacher, and who was bold to confront even the Empress Eudocia and to faithfully preach the faith no matter what the cost, and eventually being banished for his faithful preaching in calling the emperor and the empress to account for their faith. for their professed faith. Now, the 4th century, you will also see here in the 4th century a man by the name of Ambrose, another very influential man who was a politician, and then he became a bishop and church leader in Milan. And he spoke to the court, to the emperor, in the emperor's summer home city of Milan. And he greatly influenced as well a young man in his congregation named Augustine. Augustine is one of the great men of church history. Augustine is also of the 4th century, and we will be looking at him. He is really post-Constantinople, post-381. He didn't really have anything to do with Constantinople, but he followed right after that and defended Orthodox Christian faith. And so he is also of the latter part of the 4th century and the early part of the 5th century. And his writings, you will be examining some of those next week, and you will learn more about him next week. So he was one of the greatest theologians and philosophers of the Western Church. He's quite an amazing man and tremendously influential in his theological writings, from the Trinity to baptism to dealing with heresies like Donatism and Pelagianism and Manichaeism, to church-state relations in his day with his great work, the City of God, which would influence the Western medieval culture between church and state relations for centuries. Augustine was so important that it was said in the Reformation time that the Reformation was really an argument about who could claim the writings and teachings of Augustine, who could claim Augustine as their own, the Reformers or the Roman Catholic Church. That's how influential Augustine was. You also encounter another man, contemporary of Augustine, a man that communicated with Augustine, and they were somewhat friends and wrote to each other. His name is Jerome. He's another great theologian and a tremendous translator of the Bible. And he is the one that gave us the Latin Vulgate version of the Bible that became the classic Bible of the Roman Catholic Church, eventually in the West. And as well, as part of that, he contributed to some misunderstandings of theology. And so you will probably talk a little bit more about some of those things when you get to the Reformation period, because some of these misunderstandings in soteriology would need to be remedied in the Reformation by men like Erasmus and Luther. So hang on as we head into the great 4th century, a tremendous and foundational century where, once again, men, church fathers, were building on the work of other church fathers who had came before them. And they were discipling and growing the church into further maturity in the faith, grasping a stronger understanding of the depths of Scripture, so that we might have our faith today, and we stand on their shoulders even in our day. And so enjoy the readings that are taking place with the early church fathers in the 4th century, and really try to grasp what they are saying, that you may understand better our great God and our great King.